Thank you very much for that introduction, and my thanks to various colleagues who have taken care of me today. One of the nice things about going on these lecture tours is that you either see old friends or you make new friends. And for the speaker, it's almost always a very nice thing to be invited to talk. I'm starting here with a gold coin for any layman in the group who think that archaeologists just find gold or just look for gold. This is one of very, very few gold coins we have found in our excavations. We have 8 of them, and by contrast, we have 80,000 bronze coins, and we've been digging for 88 years. So you get 1 gold coin every decade, so if you're looking for gold, this is a bad way to do it. Get out your panning thing and head to a river and you'll have a better chance. But this is a nice one to start with because it was found in an archaeological context dating to about 500 BC. So it's absolutely certain as to its date. And it's an Athenian coin made of electrum. It's a mix of silver and gold. And it was made and minted before the Athenians chose their owl as the standard device that they put on their coins for literally centuries. But what's nice about it, because of that context, there are 6 other examples of this kind of coin in the world. And they are all in museums, and none of them has what you and I would call a provenience. We do not know where any of them came from. And we found this coin just in time because a colleague of ours had written a paper arguing that this particular coin, this type of coin with the bull's head on it, was a fake, and that the 6 examples we had in various museums were fakes. And happily, we found this one and told him about it a few weeks before he was about to publish his article, which he then amended, as you can imagine, quite extensively in order to demonstrate whatever else he wanted to say about this coin. So we're beginning with this coin, and when you see another gold coin, you can breathe a sigh of relief because that means we're at the end of the lecture. In between, you're going to see no gold at all. We're going to see nothing if I don't figure out the buttons. There we go. This is just to show you the size of that coin. Okay. The girl who found it was so pleased that she now has it as a tattoo on her ankle. But she was very, very sharp-eyed. The nice thing about gold, the reason gold is so valuable is because it comes out of the ground the way it goes in. So despite the tiny size of this coin, we didn't find it sieving or sifting or anything like that. She just spotted it as she turned over the dirt. So again, that's enough about coins, but I just wanted you to appreciate just how little gold we have, and when we find it, how little the piece of gold is. Okay? What we're really going to talk about are the Agora excavations, which you see here. They are, woo, that's not the right one. I will get this under control before the end of the lecture, I promise. What you have is an area of great big excavations with a pretty much full ancient temple of the 5th century BC on one side of the site, and on the other side of the site you can see the roof of our reconstructed museum over there, and this is what is known as the Agora. We've been digging here since 1931, and the reason we've been digging so long is that pretty much everything you see within this area here, when we started, was covered with modern houses. So to dig this, we have ripped out 250 houses. And then we dug down 15 or 20 feet to find the classical remains. And then we eventually landscaped it as an archaeological park. So if you go there today, there are many, many trees, and they're nicely grown up now. This picture was taken 30 years ago before the trees really began to grow. But this has been, as Phil said, a very large project because it's also almost urban renewal in order to get at it. Oops, nope, I'm not going to control it. Here you are in antiquity. Just to place it for you, right here, there's the Acropolis. Here are the city walls and the main city gate. And here's the great processional way, the Panathinaik way, that led from the city walls up to the Acropolis. And this is the scene that you see carved on the Parthenon frieze. And as they went along, halfway along, they came to this great big open square. You have to think away that building there and this building here because they're Roman and they got there later. So think those away, and you can see that basically what the Agora is just a great big open square. And it's multifunctional. You could go down there one day and they would be having an election. You could go down the next day and there might be a theatrical performance. Go down the third day and it might be set up as a marketplace. Go down the next day and there'd be a religious procession going through. Go down the fifth day and it's athletic contests. It's the place where you could get all the citizens together for whatever spectacle or whatever civic activity you wanted to carry out. And that meant around the sides of this great square was the logical place to build all the buildings you need for your government. And so essentially, all these buildings around the edge, which we're excavating, they all are associated with the world's first known democracy. So the quality of the buildings isn't much, the art historical value is debatable, but in terms of political history and in terms of how we do things, this is a very, very important site, and that's why we've taken so much time and so much money to expose it. This is what it would have looked like in antiquity. Just to give you an idea, you have the executive branch. That's sort of like the American system. There are three branches of government. So that's the office of one of the chief magistrates there, something just below the president. There's the Senate building. They had a Senate just like us, 500 people. The big difference, and this is something we want to think about. I'm going to get off on a track here, but our notion that somehow we derive from Athenian democracy is a little bit skewed. On the bad side, it was a slave society and women didn't get to vote. On the good and different side is their idea of free and open elections is a laugher. They couldn't care less about that because what they did is they allotted these offices. They pulled names out of a hat. Now I ask you, if we opened up the US phone book and picked 500 names, if we could do any worse than the bunch of clowns we have sitting in Congress now. You would have 30 or 40 wackos on the left and 30 or 40 wackos on the right. In the middle, you would have 400 people trying to make a decent law, and you could build in the term limit, so after 3 years they left and we opened up the phone book again. It's an interesting question if we need free and fair elections, because the Greeks didn't really believe in them. So they would allot 500 people to serve for 1 year as their senators, and they sat in there. And then because nothing has changed since antiquity except the technology, and that's the main lesson of studying antiquity, right next to it is the Senate dining chamber where the senators were fed at public expense during their 1 year in office. This building right next to it is the archive building. This is the Bureau of Standards. This is the Mint. And over here are the law courts. So you have the executive branch, the legislative branch, and the judiciary, all represented in the buildings right around the great open square, which you can see here without the later Roman buildings. And these buildings are all the things we've been digging at the moment. And what we're going to talk about this evening is the northwest corner of the square right over here, I think. So if you want a parallel, there's a really big one. The great open mall in Washington with all the government buildings somewhere in the immediate vicinity. And this is what it looks like in a plan. Here they're of different colors. The blue are the classical buildings. Red are in Roman. These orangey ones are Hellenistic. So it built up over time. It didn't just happen in one moment. It was a process. Not an event, but that will give you some idea. Don't worry about the details because we're not going to concern ourselves with those. I'm going to stop this in a minute. And this is where we're digging. And here is a building. It's what's called in Greek architecture a stoa. So we've labeled what we think it is, a building known as the Painted Stoah. And this is showing you the modern houses that lie on top of it that we have to remove in order to find the rest of it. And there's a modern street here which we'll also cut so that we can join all this area here to the main area down here to the south. Let me just try something here. Yeah. So what you see here is the trench. You can orient yourself by the Acropolis in the background. You're looking southeast. There's our reconstructed museum. Here are our trenches, and this is what we're going to be concentrating on, a building, some of which is over here, some of which is over here, some of which is underneath this modern building. So that building has to go, and this building has to go, and that street has to go. And once we dug all those down, we will have done what we set out to do almost a century ago, and that is to find all the public buildings that face onto the open square, which is the Agora. And this is what we found way back in the early 80s. It's not that way back because somebody who dug with us, Professor Hoff, is still with you. He's not retired yet, he's not dead. So it's not that long ago. It's within human memory. He was a student in those days, and he is part of the people the team which found this building. So you have here the west end of the building, steps going up here, and this is the back wall, which you can see disappears into this great mass of earth that was unexcavated at the time. Since then, if you come now, you'll find the earth is right down here, and within a year or two, we're going to get to the floor of the building, and then we're going to take out that coffee shop and get the rest of it. So here is the end of the building that we found, the west end of the building that we found in the 1980s. Greek architecture is so regular that you only need a few pieces to restore the building, so that we can actually restore the building on paper right now. It has Doric columns every 2 meters across the front. It has a row of Ionic columns every 4 meters apart running down the middle, and then 3 solid walls, and no rooms in the back, no second story. And it's 50 meters long, so just over 150 yards long, a football field and a half, but it's about 40 or 50 feet deep from here to the back wall. And as I say, these colonnaded buildings are known as stoas. And this is what it would look like in 3 dimensions. You can see it with its Doric facade. Right across the street from a tiny little stoa that's only 50 feet long, and that is the office of the chief religious magistrate of the city. And so that is where Socrates was indicted for impiety when he was charged with corrupting the youth of Athens and introducing new gods into the city of Athens. So many of the public buildings of the city are very, very simple. All they really need to do is provide you with shelter from either the summer sun or the winter wind and rain. But otherwise, you get all the light and fresh air you need through these open colonnades. So stoas are a common form of public building. And this is what we think the building looks like. Here's what we dug in 1981, 82. And this is what we found, a little bit more of the back wall lining up with these foundations. And we have, it doesn't show here, we have a little bit of the west wall right there. So we have the 2 ends of the building, and that we found in 2007. So it took us, whatever that is, 27 years to get the 2 ends of the building. The coffee shop I showed you sits right in the middle here, and that's why it has to go, so we can get the rest of the building. But this will show you how an architect restores the building with a run of columns there and half that number of columns on the inside. And here, when we dug this area here, our architect looked at this, and he drew a plan, and he told us where all the other columns were going to be. And then 27 years later, we actually found this column in place, 100 feet away and separated by a modern building, and it was 1.5 inches from where our architect said it would be. And either our architect or the Greek architect building this building was off by 1.5 inches, but that's pretty good. So we were told we'd find one there, and I will show you bits and pieces of that a little bit later. For that eastern end, you can see here, there's part of the back wall of the building, and here is the column in place. There's a marble disc, and then there's an unfluted limestone shaft sitting on top of it, the whole thing supported by a foundation here. And there, we had to dig out a medieval pit, we had to dig out a modern cesspit, and dig sideways just to prove that the east end of the building was there. So we actually have physically the two ends of the building. And it stands in certain areas up to about your chest. And it's very, very beautifully built. But I just want you to see that column. And here is a view of it right here from the side. So you can see its foundation, its marble disc, and its limestone shaft. This is one of the interior Ionic columns. And the best parallel for it is just down the line at the Kerameikos excavations, where they have a building with columns dating to the late 5th century BC. And you can see the arrangement is exactly the same, a plain marble disc supporting an unfluted limestone shaft. So we know pretty much what the building looks like, but we still like to work on it because there are things to be said about it. Here's the back wall. It's beautifully built. It's a limestone building, not a marble building, and it's a civic building, not a religious building. So they're not building in marble, they're building in limestone, but they're building very, very carefully with little decorative rebates and things of that sort. And it's a beautifully constructed building. From pottery found up against it, we know that it dates to about 475, 470 BC. And it's a beautifully constructed building. And based on its size, based on its location, and based on its high quality, we are tempted to identify it with a building known from the literary sources, known as the Poikile, which means the Painted Stoah. And we know quite a lot about the Painted Stoah from written sources. And if we're identifying this building correctly, which I think we are, then we know a lot about the building, even though we haven't finished digging it. We know that it was built by a relative, the brother-in-law of the Cimon, the man who preceded Pericles in the Athenian government. And in the 470s or 460s, his brother-in-law, Paisianax, was said to have built a building which first was called the Paisianactius, after the name of the man who built it, but very soon thereafter became known as the Painted Stoah because a series of panel paintings were hung along the back wall. And this is a very famous building. There are about 36 references to it in the ancient sources, which is about as many or more than there are for the Parthenon. So people have tried to find it for years, and our predecessors at one time or another have identified the end of this Hellenistic building as the Painted Stoah. And here you see it just in a drawing of 1805. And they also tried to make this building in here, which proves to be a library given to the Athenians by the Emperor Hadrian. For a long time, that was known as the Painted Stoah. So we put this name on any building we could in a desperate effort to find it because it was such a famous building. Here is that Library of Hadrian here that you can see is really pretty Roman, but also very well preserved. So it's neither of those buildings. They're both identified now as the Stoa of Attalus and the Library of Hadrian. But what people really wanted to find was the Painted Stoah. So we think it's the Painted Stoah given to the Athenians by the family of Cimon in about 470 BC and named after the paintings that were hung up on the wall. There are other connections perhaps with Cimon, and this is one of the more interesting ones. We're outside the building. This is the back of the building here, and we're digging down to foundation levels. We're not there yet, but when we get down there, we find two water pipes. This small one, about 6 inches in diameter, dating to the 4th century BC. And then below that at a deeper level, a really handsome monster pipe here, which is about 10 centimeters in diameter, made up of sections, and you can see one of the joints here, sections about 2.5 meters long that are collared so they fit one into another. It's a beautifully constructed gravity flow water supply or aqueduct, and it runs all the way along the back wall of our building, which is associated with Cimon. And that's interesting because Plutarch, in his Life of Cimon, chapter 13, tells us that Cimon is the man who turned the academy from a dry and waterless spot to a well-watered grove. which is to say he landscaped it and provided enough water that trees could grow there. And we know the direction in which this pipe is going. What they're doing is they're taking water out of downtown Athens and they're carrying it off to the northwest outside of the city. So it runs all along the back wall of our stoa, the other side of that roof. Our Greek colleagues have found a section of that aqueduct right here, 80 meters to the west. Our German colleagues have found it going right outside the ancient city gate. And then you go another kilometer and a half out to about here. We don't have the pipe, but right out there is where we have Plato's Academy. So this water is being taken from central downtown Athens and being piped about 2.5 or 3 miles out toward the academy. And this is what we talk about, the groves of Academe, and you guys are all enjoying it. This is the water supply system that created the original grove of Academe, where Plato eventually founded his philosophical school. But what I want to think about tonight is just that association between Kimon and this particular building, which he is said to have been responsible for with his brother-in-law. This is what the dig looks like. And we have a survivor in the room, Christopher Haskew, one of the graduate students here, dug with us several years ago, so he can tell you about that if you really want to hear about it. We take anywhere from 50 to 70 students, most of them American, a few Greek, and a few from elsewhere in Europe, or we even take them from Ethiopia. We take them from everywhere. It looks pretty chaotic here, but actually there are people in the trench who know what's going on. There are people here like this one whose job is to actually keep the records. And we keep digital records and we keep old-fashioned handwritten notebook records so that if we make a big mistake, we can still recover. And these are just a very small part of this huge team of American students who come dig with us every year. And if you have really nothing better to do with your summers, you could consider applying to dig. We give you room and board, you have to pay your way over there. And then you get to dig from 7 in the morning till 3 in the afternoon, but we do give you the weekend off. But you can see here, we're digging here in the medieval or Byzantine levels of about 1000 AD. Here are some of the house walls. And as I say, it looks like chaos, but somebody knows what they're doing and somebody is recording what they're doing as they dig. And this is how we find things. So this is the medieval levels, and we're digging particularly a big pit down here that I want to show you for just a minute. This is the pit. You can see a couple of pots down at the bottom of the pit, right, lying on the floor. There's something there on the side we'll talk about later. And then here is the plastic bag, and it's one of several plastic bags that we filled with what you see in the lower part of this slide here, and that is goat horns. We found in this pit 804 goat horns. They'd all been taken care of because all of them, in typical fashion of good husbandry, all the tips of the horns have been cut off at the time the goats were still running around and could stab either the goat herd or a fellow goat. So they simply cut off the tips of all the horns. And this is all we found in this pit in terms of animals. We did not find the rest of the goat. All we found were the horns. And this is probably the only part of the goat that they couldn't figure out how to use. And so when the animal died or was slaughtered or whatever happened to it, they would throw those away in this pit. So we have a pit full of goat horns. And then here are the 4 pots that date probably to somewhere around 1000 AD. They're all fairly courseware pots. And the other thing that's interesting when you really look at them, which we have, is almost all of them have flaws that may have occurred while they were being fired, and I can't guarantee they were ever actually used as pots, but they were just thrown away as well. But this is signs of medieval activity, of which we have a great deal overlying the classical levels. And on the side of the pit, we have this big piece of marble that was just coming out, and we continue to work on that. There you can see a little bit more of it, and from here it began to make some sense. This is a sculpted marble shield with a device on it, a decorative device, and that's obviously a big club, and that is probably Heracles Club. And then on top, this is the top of the monument, that's the bottom. It's just been tipped over. This here draped over another shield. You see the rim of another shield here, and draped over it is a leather cuirass. So what we're getting is a pile of armor, and then up here we have cuttings for a statue. So it looks like we have a marble statue of somebody standing on a pile of weapons and armor. So presumably we're dealing with a victorious general of some sort. And we have no inscriptions. We don't have the base on which this stood. So we are not tied down by the facts. And that means we can guess anything we want about this. So the game then, without any inscriptions, is to guess who captured these weapons and what sort of weapons they were. And that's a fairly fun game. Here you can see two of the shields. There's the third shield there. Here's the end of the cuirass, the leather corselet. Over here you see the handle of a sword and the thing that would protect your hand. Most of the blade lies here behind the shield. But there's enough here, particularly with this club, to give us a big hint as to whose weaponry this successful general is standing on, because the royal family of Macedon thought they were from the city of Argos, and they thought they were descendants of Heracles. So when you first look at it, the first guess is the club tells you this is Macedonian armor. The other thing that suggests that is the cuirass is life size. We measured it out, and I could easily wear this cuirass. It's 75 centimeters long, and that's just right for protecting your chest and your groin. This shield, the sword here, is just about life size. So if that's life size and that's life size, the shields, if they're life size, are rather small. Generally, a good Greek shield is 3 feet in diameter, and it's called a hoplite shield. These guys are about 70 centimeters, about 2 feet in diameter, so they're a little small. And the people who use these small shields, if we're talking about life size, are the Macedonians, because they are famous for carrying this sarissa, this 16-foot spear that they use to stab their enemies. And it's really, really hard to carry both a 3-foot shield and a 16-foot spear. And in many of their monuments, we see that in fact they carried a smaller shield than the rest of the Greeks. So what we're seeing here, again, everything suggests that this is a Macedonian monument, or Macedonian weapons. Here you can see a Heracles Club on a Macedonian coin, a coin of King Philip. You can see another one here on a marble thing. The tip of the S is there, and again, it's King Philip. This is another Heracles Club found in the tomb at Vergina, just to make the point that a Heracles Club is a Macedonian symbol. And then if you look at Macedonian tombs, whether a piece of a statue or whether wall paintings, reliefs, time and again, there's ours, you can see that this turned over handle, often decorated as the head of a bird or an animal, is very common in the Macedonian world. And then even better is this monument here, which is a virtual twin of the one we found in Athens. Again, it's a bunch of shields leaning up against each other, and here you can see the footprint, in this case, of a bronze statue. But otherwise, it's the twin brother or the first cousin of our base. It's a pile of weaponry decorated with Macedonian symbols. Here you can see, looks very much like the coin right there. And here's the Heracles Club, and then the pile of shields and the footprint up there. This was found on the island of Delos. So we have 2 of these shields, which is really very, very useful because it suggests without much doubt that the man standing on this pile of weaponry must have beaten a Macedonian army. And then you ask the question, if you're a historian, okay, which general, when did the Athenians ever beat the Macedonians? The answer is never. So you have to put a Roman general who were allied with the Athenians against the Macedonians, standing on this pile of weaponry. And that works particularly well for the general Aemilius Paulus, who beat the Macedonians with Athenian help in 167 BC. And after he beat them, he gave the island of Delos, where this guy was found, to the Athenians. So it looks like both on Delos and in Athens, a statue of this victorious general and ally of the Athenians was set up, showing him standing on a pile of captured weaponry. And that was found right in here. Our stoa, the front of the stoa runs right across there. And here you're seeing some of the medieval walls from the houses of about 1000 AD. So we're right in front of the stoa. And the thing about the stoa that's interesting is, unlike all the other buildings I showed you at the beginning from the Agora, the stoa serves no function. Every other building, certain civic activities are supposed to take place at certain times of day under certain magistrates. The stoa is built and used as a hangout. That means that it was full of Athenians all day, every day, and if they were in the building, they were goofing off. So that made them like shooting fish in a barrel if your business depends on a crowd, like a juggler or a sword swallower or a beggar, all of whom are attested as having hung out at the Painted Stoah. And what's nice about that is, and no Athenian, if you approach somebody when they were in the Stoa, they couldn't say they were too busy to talk to you, otherwise it wouldn't be in the building at all. So they're just marked targets. And amongst those whose trade requires a crowd or an audience are the philosophers. And so when the philosopher Zeno comes to Athens from Cyprus in 300 BC, he looks around and he sees that Plato has established the Academy in a gymnasium outside the city walls of Athens. He sees that Aristotle has founded his school, the Lyceum, in a gymnasium outside the walls of Athens. And by contrast, he sets up his school in the most central part of the city, right at the Agora Square, in a building he has every right to use as anybody else. And he starts collecting his audience there, and within a matter of months, when he has a bunch of followers, he and his followers from their classroom become known as the Stoic philosophers. And that's where we get that term, that's where we get that branch of philosophy, or its terminology, is from the building that we're discussing today. Because it has no function, because it's so popular, that means if you have the right to set up a statue or a monument, the best place to set it up so everybody's going to see it is right in front of this stoa. So when we dig away the rest of the area in front of the stoa, we will probably find all sorts of monuments reflecting the history of Athens, statue bases and inscriptions set up to record Athenian history in the most prominent spot in the city. And that trophy base is sort of a down payment for what we're going to find when we get deeper. And here is another one. You can see here we dug a deep pit down to make sure things were there to justify taking out these later walls. And we got a piece of marble still built into some late Roman installation, but it's reused. And the block itself is earlier, and it carries an inscription. And it's on its side here. You can see if you turn your head to the right. And we dug it from here on down, so we dug it backwards, and we get just 1 or 2 letters a day. But it turns out to be a fairly important and impressive inscription. It's a statue base as well. And this statue is for a man called Euclides, the son of Herodes. And this is why Professor Hoff has just woken up. He wrote his dissertation on this very subject. And he knows who this man is, and as we go down, there's more and more of it, but you can see the name, I think, right here, Euclane, Herodou, and then once we get down and get the rest of it over here, it says of Marathon. And why that's interesting and why that's important and who Euclides is, and there's the whole base. So we have all the letters on this base. And what's interesting about it is Euclides of Marathon, the son of Herodes, was responsible for building the Roman period marketplace in Athens, known as the Market of Caesar and Augustus, from the great big entrance gate that you see here. And this gate and the entire complex behind it was the subject of Professor Hoff's dissertation. Right up here is a dedicatory inscription telling us about the fundraising for this building. And happily, you can't read you can read a handful of the letters now, but it's way up and it's very worn. Happily, here's a nice drawing of it done in 1805 when the condition was very much better. And if we look even more closely, there's the whole inscription. And then here is what part we want. There is Eucleus Marathoniou, Eucles of Marathon, who built this. So it's the same man, there's no question about that. He is being honored for having provided the Athenians with this handsome public building. But interesting to me is his statue is not set up at the very building he built, but it's set up in front of the Painted Stoah where everybody was going to see it. He is the ancestor of this man here, and this is Herodes Atticus, who was active about 150 years later in 140 AD, and he was the greatest single benefactor to Athens as a private citizen and responsible for giving the Athenians their handsome marble stadium that you see here, as well as the great Odeon or concert hall on the south slopes of the Acropolis, which bears his name as well. So we can trace this man through 5, 6, or 7 generations doing good things for Athens with this marketplace in about 10 BC, and doing his descendants doing good things 150 years later in 150 AD. So here you have your Stoa. There is where the Macedonian monument was found. This new piece was found right here. So again, we have 2 examples now of really primary evidence where people wanted to set up their statues right in front of this building, which again is the most public building in Athens. You can see you can't even close the door because there is no door, it's open spaces. And I want to say briefly about the paintings, which are back here. Those go up soon after the building's built. It's first called the Paisionactius after its builder. A beautiful series of paintings go up on the back wall. And from that it becomes known as the Painted Stoah, or in Greek, the Stoa Poikile. And those paintings go up in 450 BC, 600 years later, when the Roman traveler Pausanias comes through town and describes all the monuments of Athens. He can still describe 4 of those original paintings for us. And it's hard in Greek art. You always study the sculpture, you study the architecture, you study the painting, the vases with their painting, but you never get to study the wall painting or the panel painting because it doesn't survive. But in this case, we know when the paintings went up, and we have a description of them 600 years later. So you can think of this building first as the world's first public art museum. Plenty of art, plenty of beautiful art before this, but it's in the palace, it's in the royal tombs, it's in the holy of the temples. It's not there for everybody. But this is the absolute opposite. Here is the main public square of Athens. Here is a building on the north side where the doors are never closed. Everybody is allowed and welcome to come in, stroll up and down the shade of the colonnade, admiring these great paintings. In 396 AD, excuse me, 300 years after Pausanias, or 250 years after Pausanias, the bishop Synesius comes to Athens, and he is really, really grumpy. It's like the way you guys have been complaining about the weather. Nothing is making him happy, and what is not making him happy is he came all the way to Athens in order to see these fabulous paintings, and a Roman proconsul had taken them away just a few months before. So the paintings are gone. We don't have to look for the paintings. The paintings would be a conservation nightmare. So if I tell you the absolute truth, I'm glad we didn't find the paintings. But nonetheless, the building, again, gives you some idea. The world's first public art museum, and then a great center of learning as the philosophical school of the Stoics. And we dug recently in this area here is where we've been concentrating at the east end of the building. And there we got some information about the later phases as well. Here you see our aqueduct built by Cimon on its way to the Academy. Here's the back wall. There's the one interior column. And you can see late deposits that have built up and the mouth of a well which was driven down through the floor of the Stoa. And if we look here, you can see one of these wells. There are two of them. There's one of the wells. And the other thing they're doing is really interesting. They're walling up the space from this column to the next column. You see that rubble wall there? And then you see a rubble wall here going from the column toward the back wall and toward the front colonnade. What they're doing here is exactly what the Theodosian Law Code says you may not do. This is private individuals taking over a public building for their own use. They have no use at all for a great big open colonnade. So instead, they wall it up into a series of individual shops. And then some of these shops need a water supply, so they're drilling holes down through what had been the open colonnade of the Stoa, but now is just a row of 15 or 20 shops set side by side. This in the 5th century AD. And at this time, we're outside the city walls of Athens, and most municipal authority must have broken down. And again, I'm not sure they had authority outside the walls. So people are doing this with impunity, even though Theodosius' law code says you absolutely can't do it in the 5th century AD. So we get to dig the wells. One of the wells is this one this one right here. Here's the second one here. You can see the sort of cross walls of later rubble walls that are dividing these into individual rooms that are in fact not associated with each other at all. They're probably different establishments. What those establishments are, we find by digging the wells. So this is what it looks like when you dig a well. That person is volunteered, I promise you. And indeed, they have to volunteer to come dig for us, and they have to volunteer to go into a well, and everybody wants to go into the well. The reason for that is it's 100 degrees up here, and it's 55 degrees down here. And you are digging in your shorts, and the water is coming up to your waist, and you're cool and collected and calm. So everybody wants to do it. There is a pump down there, so when he wants, he can call for the pump, and that's turned on. All the water is taken by this hose and dumped way over here. So it doesn't look quite as dire as it is. And as I say, you have to go by the smile on his face. He's not unhappy. And the reason they like to dig the wells is those are like time capsules. In antiquity, when you dropped or threw something in a well, nobody was going to go after it. And it would stay there until we dig it. So when you dig a well, you find masses of material, most of it virtually intact. And so here you see just a few of the pots that were found from that well, a perfectly good oil lamp. This is the kind of writing goes on the shoulder to tell you the capacity and whatever's in that jar. Lots of information, but what I want you to notice is almost all of it is made up of wine pitchers. And that is true of both of those wells. So in the 4th and particularly the 5th centuries AD, the Stoa is being used as a series of bars. Okay? So it's got a long and interesting history. It starts as the world's first public art museum. It goes on to be one of the great educational centers of Athens. It ends up as part of the red light district where everybody went outside the city walls in order to drink too much. That's in, of course, 900 years. It starts in 450, it ends in 450. So we're talking about a long life for this building over time, but we seem to have the archaeological evidence for all of it. This in the 5th AD, a meter above, this represents when they're actually using the well. And then when the well goes out of use, they throw trash into it. So for Professor Saperstein, we will look at the roofs because Professor Saperstein is the great expert on the roof of Greek buildings, in case you didn't know that. So here are the roof tiles that came out a meter above the period of use fill. We were just looking at when the building is actually falling apart, around 450 or 460 AD. We have a whole bunch of pieces, and then we have some better examples here. 460s and 470s is when we have some reason to believe that the Vandals passed through. Basically, the way it works for Athens is there is one destruction every century starting in the 2nd century AD. It's the Marcomanni in the 2nd century AD, the Herulians in the 3rd century AD, Alaric and the Visigoths in the 4th century AD, the Vandals in the 5th century AD, and the Slavs in 582, 583. We have a long sort of century apart. The city keeps getting whopped. Most of what we have from the well, most of our information, including this one here, the one you've all been waiting for, this is the gold Vandal period coin that was found. And again, what we find is if your If you drop a gold coin, you look for it until you find it. The only reason not to do that is if a vandal is chasing you. And that's what we have here, a coin dating to the time when we think the Vandals attacked Athens. And that explains the demise and the end of this building, which was, as you can now see, one of the great centers of ancient Athens. And you get gold at the beginning, you get gold at the end, but the real treasure is the story I've been telling you in between. Thank you very much.